professor in the USC Department of Psychiatry and assistant research professor here at the Brain and Creativity Institute. I'm also the director of the USC Center for Mindfulness Science, and we're happy to be hosting Richie at this first Mindfulness Science keynote of the year. Before formally announcing Dr. Davidson, I'd like to say a few short words about the center. We received startup funding from the USC Office for Research starting last year, and as a center, we are devoted to establishing an academic center of excellence in mindfulness science here at USC. Some of our collaborating partners include the USC Institute for Integrative Health, Mindful USC, and Insight LA. As some of you may know, Mindful USC has been offering widespread mindfulness training here at USC to faculty, staff, and students for the past 5 years. This is one of the first and largest university mindfulness training programs in the United States. And as a center, we're planning to build a research enterprise assessing the impact of Mindful USC training and related, for our students here at USC, as well as more generally the impact of mindfulness and related contemplative practices on various measures of human health and well-being. The center is comprised of a community of scholars from multiple schools and departments, including the Department of Psychology, the Brain and Creativity Institute, the Marshall School of Business, Keck School of Medicine, Departments of Psychiatry and Preventive Medicine, the USC Chan Division of Occupational Sciences, the USC Suzanne Dworak Heck School of Social Work, and the USC Leonard Davis School of Gerontology, and the Rossier School of Education. We hope to capitalize on this broad-based expertise across many academic disciplines to foster a thriving center of research on the domains of mindfulness and the promotion of well-being through contemplative practices. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge our strategic partners, Mindful USC and the USC Institute for Integrative Health, and a big thank you to Antonio and Hannah Damasio for allowing us to use this wonderful hall. And thank you to Dr. Davidson for being with us here at USC today. I'd like now to give an introduction to Dr. Davidson. William James Billis, Research Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry and founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds, University of Wisconsin-Madison. Richie received his PhD from Harvard University in psychology and has been at Wisconsin since 1984. He's published more than 400 articles, numerous chapters and reviews, and edited 14 books. He's the author with Sharon Begley of The Emotional Life of Your Brain, published by Penguin in 2012, and co-author with Daniel Goleman of Altered Traits, Science Reveals How Meditation Changes Your Mind, Brain, and Body, published by Penguin Books in 2017. Dr. Davidson is the recipient of numerous awards for his research, including the William James Fellow Award from the American Psychological Society. In the year 2000, he was recipient of the Most Distinguished Award for Science, given by the American Psychological Association, the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award. He was the founding co-editor of the new American Psychological Association journal, Emotion. And in 2003, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and was named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine in 2006. He serves on the Scientific Advisory Board at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences from 2011 to 2020. He's a current member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Mental Health. And in 2017, he was elected to the National Academy of Medicine. In 2018, appointed to the governing board of UNESCO's Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. His research is broadly focused on the neural bases of emotion and emotional style and methods to promote human flourishing, including meditation and related contemplative practices. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Richie Davidson.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. And the last time I was in USC, I was just reminiscing, this building was just being built, and it's truly an honor and a privilege to be here and to see friends in the Center for Mindfulness, and particularly to see Antonio and Juana, who have been close friends for so many years. I'd like in this talk to share with you a little bit about the journey that we've been on. I am a neuroscientist by training, and when I first began my career, I started with a simple question that still is a driving question for much of what we do. And the question, simply put, is why is it that certain people are more vulnerable to life's slings and arrows, and why are others more resilient? And how can we nurture qualities to promote flourishing that may enable people to be more resilient and to live a more wholesome and meaningful life? In the early part of my career, I focused a lot on the adversity side of the equation and studied the brain mechanisms that were associated with vulnerability to psychopathology and stress reactivity. And then something quite significant happened to me in 1992 where I really began to shift in another direction. And in 1992, I first met the gentleman who's shown here. This is His Holiness the Dalai Lama. This is a photograph that was taken in 2001 when he was visiting our lab. He's actually been there many times. In fact, he's been to Madison, Wisconsin 16 times since he has been in exile. And it's the most number of times he's been in any city under 500,000 outside of India, which is pretty cool. And so we've been very blessed to have him as a kind of inspirer in chief. And when I first met the Dalai Lama, he challenged me. He said, "You've been using tools of modern neuroscience to study stress and anxiety and depression. Why can't you use those same tools to study kindness and to study compassion?" And that was a wake-up call for me. I didn't have a great answer for him in 1992, other than that it's hard. But when we first started to study anxiety and stress, that was hard too. And I think most scientists would agree that we've made at least a little bit of progress in understanding those adversity side of the equation states. So the work that we and others are doing are built on a platform, on a foundation. And I'd like to spend the first few minutes to review some key themes that really provide the foundation for all this work and say a little bit about our kind of unique take on these themes. The first is a word that I'm sure all of you have heard before, neuroplasticity. And it's simply meant to remind you that the brain changes in response to experience. And our brains are constantly being shaped, wittingly or unwittingly. And I would invite you to consider the possibility that our brains are shaped unwittingly most of the time. Most of the time we're unaware of the forces around us which are shaping our brain, and most of the time we have little access to processes that enable us to actually voluntarily control our brains. And so the invitation in this work is that we can all take more responsibility for the shaping of our own brains rather than leaving that willy-nilly to the forces around us. The second theme is a related theme in the realm of genomics, and that is epigenetics. It's the science of how our genes are regulated. And what this work is showing is that the regulation of our genome is subject to many of the same forces that shape our brains. And there are factors in the environment. In fact, modern neuroscientific research clearly shows, for example, that the way a mother behaves toward her offspring can induce epigenetic changes in the offspring that shape the structure and function of the brain of that offspring for the entire duration of its life. And in fact, recent work shows that these epigenetic changes can actually be passed down for at least a couple of generations. At one point in the not too distant past, this was considered Lamarckian in science fiction, and we now know that this is the way our biology works. And this is not fringe science, this is mainstream molecular biology. The third theme is the increased understanding of the bidirectional communication between the mind and the brain and the body. And actually, the work of Antonio Damasio and his colleagues have been instrumental in helping to shape our understanding of the bidirectional pathways. We now know that changes in the body can influence the state of the brain, and changes in certain brain circuits have profound effects on the body, and there's constant bidirectional communication. And this opens the possibility for us understanding how the cultivation of well-being may actually impact not just the brain, but have downstream effects on the body, which turn out to be consequential for our physical health. And it allows us to begin to understand more mechanistically something that has been illustrated in epidemiological studies, which is that a person's reports of their psychological well-being are associated with physical health. People who report themselves to have higher levels of well-being are indeed physically healthier. The best data for that come from a series of studies done with British civil servants, the so-called British Whitehall studies, but there's a whole genre of epidemiological work which is consistent with this overall idea. And finally, the last theme that I'd like to name at the very beginning is probably the most controversial of these four, and I'll show you a little bit of data relevant to it because it is controversial, but also I think is one that has so much important significance. And that is, I'd like you to consider the possibility that humans are born with innate basic goodness. That is, they show a propensity from the very beginning to prefer warm-hearted, altruistic encounters compared to those that are selfish and aggressive. It doesn't mean that the negative stuff isn't there, but it simply means that if an organism is given a choice, and particularly a human organism is given a choice, it will choose the pro-social alternative. Now, many of you might be wondering, how can I possibly say that in light of all the craziness in the world today? And I'll show you the evidence in just a moment, but this also can help us to understand why practices that are designed to cultivate kindness and compassion are actually very easily accessible, and the scientific evidence shows that these practices can produce impact on objective measures, behavioral and biological, very, very quickly. After just a few minutes of practice. It doesn't mean that those changes will stick, but it simply means that we can actually tap into this basic goodness. So what kind of evidence is there? I'll just show you one example. So these are short video clips that represent these puppet scenarios that have been shown to 6-month-old babies. So I'll show you two of these. This is the first one. Okay, now the second. Which of these two clips or scenarios do you think a 6-month-old baby would prefer? And indeed, the data clearly show that. But of course, the first question you should be asking is, how can we ask a 6-month-old baby? Well, there are actually many different ways. One of them is to show the babies to hold out these puppets and to see which one it reaches for. And the data show that more than 90% of infants reach for the puppet that behaved altruistically compared to the puppet that was a nasty guy. Second way is we can look at the presence of spontaneous facial expressions. Babies smile more to the first one than the second one. We can also monitor, using eye tracking technology, the duration and location of their fixations. And it turns out that infants look more consistently than the first one, and for a longer duration. So there are many measures that all converge in showing that 6-month-old babies clearly have a preference for these interactions that are depicting an altruistic encounter. These are the kind of data, and there's a whole genre of research that points in the same direction, that suggests that there really is this thing that we can call innate basic goodness. So I want to show you also a little bit related to epigenetics, because I'm not going to talk more about this later, but just to show you what kinds of changes we and others are observing these days. I'll just give you two little data points. The first is from the study that we did, actually both from the study that we did with long-term meditation practitioners. These are individuals who have had a daily practice for 10 or more years and meet other criteria for having a consistent practice. And in the first case, we brought them into the laboratory in the morning and we had them meditate for a day of intensive practice. And we had a control group come into the lab who'd never meditated before for a day of leisure. And the control group was given the same food, they walked the same distance that the meditators walked, and they engaged in quiet activities for the whole day. We took blood samples before and after their day from both groups, and we were specifically looking at genes involved in inflammation, because other evidence suggested that these kinds of practices, particularly ones that cultivate kindness and compassion, which our long-term meditators were doing, are practices that have anti-inflammatory effects. And so we were looking for genes involved in the inflammatory cascade, and specifically looking to see the extent to which these genes are impacted by this practice. And I won't bore you with all the details, but I'll just show you one example. This gene, RIPK2, is a very important gene in the inflammatory cascade. The red line are the meditators, the blue line are the age and gender match controls. T1 is in the morning and T2 is at the end of the day. And you can see a downregulation in the expression of this gene in the meditators compared to the controls over this period of time. More recently, we have looked at markers of epigenetic aging. It turns out that epigenetic aging and chronological age are very highly correlated, as you might expect. However, some people show evidence of epigenetic aging which is faster than their chronological age. In other words, their cellular aging or biological aging is proceeding more quickly compared to their chronological age. For other people, they are aging more slowly. So we compared long-term meditators to the controls, and you can see these plots here. And if you know anything about how to read these plots, what you can see is that there are no significant differences at all in epigenetic age between these groups. However, if you look at the length of lifetime practice that we derive from a very detailed structured interview with these participants, what you see is, particularly among the women, the more years of meditation they have, the slower their epigenetic aging. And we found these effects on two separate occasions. I won't, again, bore you with details, but the data show that the more years of practice, the slower the epigenetic aging. There are other data which have looked at objective measures of brain aging and have reported very similar kinds of effects, with brain age being slowed among long-term practitioners. So I want to now jump into part of this talk on well-being as a skill by first underscoring the need. And one of the moving inspirations for framing it in this way came from the previous Surgeon General of the United States, a guy by the name of Vivek Murthy, who was appointed by President Obama. And one of Vivek Murthy's central platforms as Surgeon General of the United States was that well-being is indeed a public health need. And so in that spirit, let me just illustrate a few data points which underscore the importance and urgency of this need. The first, these are data from the World Happiness Report. This is a report that comes out each year under the auspices of the United Nations. I won't, again, go into a lot of detail about how this stuff is measured. Suffice it to say that since these measures are standard measures that come from, I think, 132 different countries, the measure is simple and crude. But nevertheless, it is a measure. And what you can see here, this blue line is North America, and what you can see is that over the last 10 years, there has generally been a decline in happiness. And I'll show you that in other ways. This is the ranking of happiness across nations in this period 2016 to 18. This is from the latest World Happiness Report. And this is where the United States falls, number 19. You can see the first three countries are Finland, Denmark, and Norway. And there are lots of discussion about why those countries are the top. But perhaps the most telling data from the World Happiness Report is to look at changes over the last 10 years in the same metric. And so that's what's displayed in the next series of charts. This is changes in happiness from 2005-8 to 2016-18, ranked for every country that had been studied. Again, there are 132 countries here. And so when the lines are going to the right, it means that there's been an increase in happiness over this period of time. And when the lines depart on the left, and you'll see that soon, it means there's been a decrease in happiness. And so I'd like to show you where the US falls on this. So this is continuing this long list of countries down to 104. You can see Jamaica and Panama are down here. And then we can see that the United States is 112 out of 132 countries. You can see Syria and Venezuela are at the bottom. We are very, very close to the bottom and showing the largest decline in happiness of any nation in the world that has been tracked using this metric. So this is a paper that was published in PNAS. Angus Deaton, of course, is someone who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for this work. And this is work documenting the first decline in life expectancy observed for any subgroup in the United States, in the United States history. So for the first time in U.S. history, there are documented declines in longevity among certain groups, and particularly among white males in the United States. And so this is looking at the deaths per 100,000 from 1990 to 2010, and you can see that there is an increase among this subgroup. And this is data from France, Germany, and a bunch of other countries, all showing declines in the death rate or increases in life expectancy. And this is just showing the causes of mortality. Some of them are from suicide, chronic liver disease is, of course, from alcohol abuse, and so forth. These are data from the Center for Disease Control, looking over the course of the last 10 years in the percentage of youth, 12 to 17, who experienced a major depression in the past year. And you see first there's a big gender difference, which has been found in every country in the West that has collected these kind of data. But more tellingly, and of more concern even, is the extraordinary increase that you see over the course of this very short period of time. And if you look at the suicide rate in this group, what you see is a frightening increase, more than doubling of the suicide rate over this very short period of time. So from these data, I think that it's fair to say we have a crisis in well-being that is not being systematically addressed. And I'd like to end this little short section with a quote from a fellow who was responsible for allocating funds for mental health research for 13 years in the United States, from Tom Insel, who was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. And he was interviewed about a year ago. This is several years after he retired from his directorship. And this is, I think, something very, very telling. He said, I spent 13 years at NIMH really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when I look back on that, I realized that while I think I succeeded at getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, I think $20 billion, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. I hold myself accountable for that. And one of the things that Tom is now a strong advocate of is behavioral interventions to change biology. With the recognition that we can use behavioral strategies to impact circuits in the brain and actually achieve more specific biological effects than we can with any known pharmaceutical today. And it's not to say that pharmaceuticals don't have a role. I'm certainly not advocating that at all, but the invitation here is to consider the possibility that we can impact a lot of these issues if we implement strategies that we can think of as preventative strategies up front. So what might those look like? Well, we have developed a framework for understanding well-being that holds that well-being rests on 4 pillars, 4 fundamental components. And this framework is derived equally from our understanding of modern science, but also from the contemplative traditions which have taught us which components of well-being are malleable, which components of well-being can we actually cultivate. So I'd like to go through this framework, which is an organizing framework for a lot of what we're doing now in our center. The first component of well-being is awareness. And awareness includes basic mechanisms of attention, and it also includes a very critical capacity that we call meta-awareness. And this has been extensively investigated by psychologists and neuroscientists. Meta-awareness is knowing what your mind is doing. Now, some of you may be thinking, what kind of crazy issue is that? We all know what our minds are doing. Well, how many of us have had the experience of reading a book where we're actually reading words on a page, and we might go through one page, might go through a second page, and then we realize we have no friggin' idea what we just read? Well, that's an example of not knowing what our mind is doing. And there are ample opportunities, I think, if we're honest with ourselves, to recognize that there are times in our day when we don't know what our mind is doing. And this feature of meta-awareness we think is extremely important, and we think it is a necessary ingredient for transformation. If you don't have meta-awareness, transformation is not possible. So the second component of well-being is connection. And connection includes qualities that foster successful interpersonal and social relationships. Qualities like kindness, empathy, having a positive outlook. The third component of well-being is insight. Insight is about self-knowledge. It is insight into the narrative that we all have about ourselves. We all carry around this narrative about who we are. And insight into the nature of this narrative is a key to well-being. When we become fused with this narrative, when we don't see the narrative for what it is, which is basically a bunch of thoughts, we can reify this narrative in a way that can be very destructive and very inconsistent with well-being. So at the very extreme, we know that there are individuals with depression who have very negative self-beliefs and who hold those beliefs to be a veritable description of who they are. And that is, of course, a prescription for suffering. So part of well-being is developing a healthy relationship to this narrative. The fourth component of well-being is purpose, having a clear sense of direction in life. And having a sense that life has meaning, and most importantly, being able to see everyday tasks, even mundane tasks, as somehow being associated with our sense of purpose. Can we appreciate that something as trivial as washing the dishes or taking out the garbage or doing your laundry could be, in fact, associated with a sense of purpose? Can we have a life where virtually everything is part of that sense of purpose? There are practices in the contemplative traditions that are designed to cultivate each of these qualities. And one of our premises is that optimal human flourishing, the cultivation of a healthy mind, requires all of these. If we just develop one to the exclusion of others, it could potentially lead to a kind of imbalance. And the metaphor for this is if you go to the gym and you just do strengthening exercises for your upper body, it's going to lead to a kind of imbalance. And the same is true for well-being. We need all four of these components in order to flourish. So let me now take a deeper dive and say a little bit more about each of them. So of course, I'm sure many of you recognize the person on the right. That is William James, and in 1890, in his two-volume tome on Principles of Psychology, he said something quite remarkable. He said, "The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compos sui if he have it not. And education, which should improve this faculty, would be the education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about." The italics are in the original William James. Now this is quite remarkable. If William James had more contact with the contemplative traditions, he would have instantaneously seen that if nothing else, they are training grounds for attention. And the fact that we don't explicitly educate attention in our schools is unconscionable, because attention is the building block for all other forms of learning. And we know that attention can be trained. In fact, a paper that came out in Science about 10 years ago by a group of psychologists at Harvard is very telling in this regard. They took advantage of the fact that we all have smartphones these days, and in several thousand people, they texted them several times a day using a methodology that we call experience sampling, or ecological momentary assessment. And they asked people 3 questions. The first question is, what are you doing right now? And they checked off from the list of activities what they're doing. Second question they asked is, where is your mind right now? Is it focused on what you're doing, or is it focused elsewhere? And the third question they asked is, at this moment, how happy or unhappy are you right now? So here's what they found. The average American adult spends 47% of her or his waking life not paying attention to what they're doing. 47% of the time. Folks, we could do better. And interestingly, when people reported that their mind was wandering, they were significantly less happy. The title of this paper is "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." Being distracted is toxic. So we've investigated how attention can be trained and how signals in the brain that we can look at as correlates may be altered through these practices. This is a photograph of a famous Tibetan monk who has come to our laboratory many times. His name is Mingyur Rinpoche, and we're reporting brain electrical activity during this open awareness practice. And this came from the first paper that we published looking at these changes. And these are gamma oscillations, fast frequency oscillations in the 40 hertz range that we see during these meditation periods and are significantly increased from a baseline resting state. This was the first report of this kind, which really, I think, helped to usher in the modern era of more systematic research on the neural changes in different forms of meditation. More recently, and I'm not going to go into these data in any detail, but I just want to show this to make the following point. These changes in attention don't depend on tens of thousands of hours of training. These are data from a very recent study of ours that's under review right now, using mindfulness-based stress reduction in otherwise meditation-naive people. This is 8 weeks of meditation, mindfulness meditation training, and this is looking at an objective behavioral measure of attention and also looking at changes in structural features of the brain that we can assess with diffusion-weighted imaging, looking at white matter connectivity. And these data simply show that we can see significant changes on certain objective measures of attention. This is a parameter that's been referred to as intrinsic alertness or tonic levels of alertness that we find to be improved in those who went through MBSR compared to control conditions. And we also see that there are changes in white matter connectivity, in white matter pathways that are important in circuits that are critical for attention, that involve connections from the thalamus. And we also see that the changes in the behavioral measures of attention and changes in these white matter structures are correlated. So the more people show these white matter changes over the course of 8 weeks, the more robust the behavioral change is. I want to say a little bit about connection. Connection really is predicated on this idea of innate basic goodness. And we have published work, as have other scientists, showing that, again, it doesn't take much to show some initial effects. It doesn't mean those effects will stick, but you can see changes in behavior in the brain quite quickly. So we did a study a few years ago where we randomly assigned people to a 2-week intervention where they received compassion training, or another 2-week intervention that was derived from cognitive therapy where they were taught to cognitively reappraise events more positively. Cognitive therapy, as many of you know, is one of the most empirically well-validated strategies for decreasing anxiety and depression and improving well-being more generally. We evaluated people on 2 basic measures. Behaviorally, we used economic decision-making tasks that allow us to look at hard-nosed metrics of altruistic behavior that we reasoned were a proxy for kindness and compassion. And we also looked at changes in specific circuits in the brain. And this was 2 weeks of training where people received 30 minutes of training a day online. So it was very low dose training, a total of 7 hours. So what we found is that on the behavioral measure, the folks who received compassion training showed significantly more pro-social behavior on economic decision-making tasks that involved donating actual real money that they were being paid as subjects, so they received less compensation compared to those who were randomly assigned to the cognitive reappraisal group. And these behavioral differences were associated with differences in functional connectivity in a circuit from the prefrontal cortex to the ventral striatum. This is a specific area of the ventral striatum nucleus accumbens, and connectivity was strengthened in this area by the compassion training, and the more functional connectivity increases we saw over the course of 2 weeks, the more altruistic the participants behaved on the economic decision-making tasks. So another thing that we've been really interested in is the impact of this kind of training on a problem that is so important and pervasive today, which is implicit bias, which a number of educational researchers believe is the root cause of the achievement gap in the United States today. This is a paper that came out in an education journal not too long ago that showed that the achievement gap is highly correlated with what educational researchers have called a disciplinary gap. And the disciplinary gap is the disproportionate administration of harsh and punitive punishment toward members of racial and ethnic outgroups. And the disciplinary gap is driven by implicit bias. So implicit bias is measured behaviorally. And for those of you who don't know what it is, if we all took right now a questionnaire measure of bias, my guess is that virtually everyone in this room would report themselves to be extremely unbiased. But I guarantee you that if I brought you into the laboratory and gave you a test of implicit bias, we would all show some level of implicit bias. This stuff is cellular, it gets under the skin, and is difficult to override, and is difficult to transform. And so we asked the question as to whether an intervention that combined elements of awareness and connection can make a dent in implicit bias among people who are just going out into the education profession in the last 6 months of teacher training to become elementary school teachers. So these are very new data. They're currently under review. But this is an implicit attitude task. It's a reaction time-based measure of implicit bias. And these data show that those who were randomly assigned to the treatment group that received mindfulness and compassion training showed a significant reduction of implicit bias immediately after the intervention. That reduction was preserved at a 6-month follow-up, which is the longest duration of time in the scientific literature that we know of in this kind of population to show a preservation of a reduction in implicit bias. So we're excited about these data because they suggest that this deep form of bias can actually be impacted through a simple intervention that combines elements of awareness and connection. Now this is something very new. These data were just published, and this is kind of a wild little story related to connection. We, over the course of the last 10 years, have collected a lot of data on long-term meditators. And part of the procedure in our lab is we always take photographs of people. We just say, please stand here, we want to get a photograph for our records of meditators, controls, everyone. Now what we decided is we had a large collection of photographs, so we thought we would give these photographs randomly to people and asked them to rate these photographs on a number of characteristics, like how conscientious do these people look, or how neurotic do they look, or how mindful. And just on the basis of this very thin slice, just this photograph. So let me give you a few examples. Who's the meditator? The one on the right or the left? Quick. Which one is the meditator? The one on the right or the left? So we did this where the participants, this was delivered over the internet to hundreds of participants. Of course, they had no idea who these people were that they were rating. And we also, by the way, this might be of interest to some of you, we gave these photographs to professional meditation teachers as well to rate, who were absolutely no different than a random participant off the street in rating these photographs. But the meditators, in LTM stands for long-term meditator. These are the controls that are age and gender matched. The meditators were rated as being significantly more comfortable looking, more conscientious, more mindful, and less neurotic than their age and gender matched counterparts. So there's something in the face that may be providing some signal that we think is interesting. One of the important missions that we're on in our center now is to develop completely passive objective measures of well-being that don't require any user input that can be captured from a mobile device. Many of you have phones that open with your face. The average American adult opens his phone approximately 200 times a day. That's a lot of facial expression data just from one day. And so we think that using a combination of inputs, we can actually derive, with the right kind of algorithms, signals that are reflective of an individual's well-being. And this is a strategy that we're engaged in now. I want to now say a little bit about insight and purpose, and then I'll end and hopefully go in a few minutes for questions. So one of the things about insight, this dimension, and insight, this is really about self-knowledge, knowledge of this narrative, is when we become overly identified with this narrative, it can lead to a lot of suffering because it creates a quality that we call, for lack of a more precise term, stickiness. And what we mean by stickiness is you have emotions which are appropriate for one context, bleeding over into a second context where they're not appropriate. So how many of you have had an experience where you might have had a difficult conversation early in the day? It could be with your spouse, with a child, with a coworker, and then you had to go into another meeting immediately right after. To what extent do the emotions from the first encounter bleed over and color what's going on in that second situation? Well, I think it's quite a common experience, and we would call this stickiness. And so we have probed this in different ways, and I'll give you some examples. So imagine that at time point 3, some stressful event occurs, and I'm drawing two hypothetical curves. So this is person A, and we can contrast this with person B, who shows the same amplitude of responding, but who much more rapidly recovers. And we can measure these recovery functions in many different systems. We can measure it directly in the brain. We can measure it in endocrine measures, for example, the recovery of cortisol after a stressful event. We can measure it in the autonomic nervous system. And these signals are very, very telling. And we think that this is so important that we define resilience as the rapidity with which you recover from adversity. That is a definition of resilience. So how can we actually look at this stuff? Well, there's a circuit between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, in this case the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which we think is very important in this, and I won't bore you with these data. They were published not too long ago in Neuroimage, just showing changes in this connectivity in meditators. But I want to focus on this study that was published a few years ago where we used pain to get at this. So this is real physical pain. We use heat. We can generate heat very reliably and very safely in the laboratory. And this is a study we did with very long-term meditators and age and gender match controls. And the design of the study is very simple. We give people an experience of the pain initially, so they know what we're talking about, and it's 10 seconds at 49 degrees centigrade. It hurts. And I've had this done to myself many times, and it's extremely painful. So we give them a single experience, and then we bring them into the laboratory and we tell them, we're going to give you a cue. When you hear that cue, you know that in 10 seconds, you're going to get zapped with this painful stimulus. And then after the painful stimulus ends, there's a recovery period. That's basically the core element of the experimental design. So here is what happens. And this is a cartoon version to make it easily digestible. So the non-meditators hear the tone telling them that they're about to get zapped. And then in looking at the pain matrix in the brain, there's a lot that we know about the neural circuits in the brain which respond to pain, so we know where to look. And when the non-meditators hear the tone that tells them that they're about to get pain, their pain network just fires away. It's as if they're getting the actual pain, but all they got is a tone, which is telling them they're about to get it. And then they respond, and it takes them quite a long time to recover. Among the expert meditators, and these are very, very highly practiced people, they come in, they get the experience before they go into the scanner of the pain, they hear the tone, and nothing changes in the pain network. Absolutely no significant change in any feature of the pain matrix. Then, when the pain comes on, they show a very robust response, and in certain parts of the pain matrix, for example, in somatosensory cortex, they actually show a significantly larger response than the controls, larger. But then when the pain goes off, they rapidly return back down to baseline. This is the neural profile of resilience. It's responding in a context-appropriate way to what is happening, and then when it's over, immediate recovery. One of the great privileges in my life is that I've gotten to spend a lot of time around His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I see him 3 or 4 times a year. And he has a greater dynamic range of emotion than any other human being I've ever met. And what I mean by that is that he will show a very strong emotional response to what is happening in the situation, and he'll immediately recover. There's no hysteresis in the system. There's no lingering. There's no stickiness. It just comes right back down to baseline. And he can show, and I've seen him show this, we see in infants, an infant going from laughing to crying just like that. That's something that most adults don't do. And I've seen this with the Dalai Lama, where he'll be told something tragic and really sad, he'll actually cry, and in the next moment he'll see something funny and he'll burst out laughing. And it's not disrespectful. It's simply responding in a context-appropriate way with no stickiness. Okay, let me end with purpose, and I'll just show you one little data point. Having a strong sense of purpose in life is the single most important psychological predictor of longevity for people in their 70s and 80s and 90s than any other psychological variable, after carefully matching for other characteristics and pre-existing medical conditions. There are a lot of data on this, and I won't, again, go over a lot of the detail, but this is just one representative study. There are many, and there's a recent paper in JAMA that reports the same thing. So these are people in the 10th percentile, the lowest percentile of purpose in life. These are people in the highest percentile, and this is the cumulative hazard ratio of death. And what you can see is looking out over time, those who are in the lowest bin, in the bottom 10%, are dying sooner compared to those who are in the 90%. So clearly, this is an attribute which has important significance for our health and well-being. And there again are specific practices which are designed to help us identify and clarify our sense of purpose, which are very accessible. So I will end here with a quote from the Dalai Lama that is from a book that was on the bestseller list for some time, which really captures the essence of this. He said, "The systematic training of the mind, the cultivation of happiness, the genuine inner transformation by deliberately selecting and focusing on positive mental states and challenging negative mental states is possible because of the very structure and function of the brain. But the wiring in our brains is not static, not irrevocably fixed. Our brains are also adaptable." Thank you very much. So the question is how compassion training is being defined. In the specific experimental case that I mentioned, where people are trained for 2 weeks, the training involves something that is commonly taught that goes roughly as follows. Participants are instructed to start with a loved one. And by a loved one, we mean someone who you have an uncomplicated, positive relationship with. It could be a close family member, a close friend. It can even be a pet. And envision a time in their life when they may have been suffering, when they may have had difficulty, and cultivate the genuine aspiration that they be relieved of that suffering and be happy. And that's basically what you do. And then you simply rest and become aware of whatever thoughts and feelings may have been generated by that, and you keep refreshing that. And we start with a loved one. We then move on to oneself. We then move on to what we call a stranger. And by a stranger, we mean a person whose face you recognize. It could be someone who works in the same building as you work in. It could be someone in the dean's office that you see but have no idea who they are or what they do. It could be a classmate. And you bring them into your mind and your heart and go through the same process, even if you don't know much about their life. Imagine a time when they may have had some difficulty. And then finally, we move on to the last category, which one meditation teacher said that 1 hour on this category is equivalent to 100 hours on the other categories, and that is bring into our mind and our heart a difficult person. Someone who pushes your buttons, may not be the most difficult person at the start, but someone who is difficult in some way. And do the same thing where you genuinely bring them into your heart and have the aspiration that they be happy and free of suffering. And so you do that for 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks, and your brain changes. And you also show these behavioral changes. Sure.
You mentioned in the case where there was applied pain that the long-term meditators, when they had a bit more reaction in the somatosensory cortex.
Mm-hmm.
How was that measured?
fMRI.
fMRI.
Yes, please.
On the concept of stickiness, you said that was related more to the insight. That was the third. How does that? What is the connection that you see there between having more personal insight or just personal having a sense of self and stickiness?
Yeah, it's when we overly identify with our sense of self and we regard the stories that we tell about ourselves as being immutable and fixed and unchangeable. that we really get into trouble. So it's loosening up those self-concepts, which is really part of the training that is important for insight. Yeah, I should say that the kind of meditation that I mentioned this in our discussions during the day today, the kind of meditation that the Dalai Lama does on a daily basis is very different than the kinds of practices that are most commonly promoted in the West today. He does not do mindfulness practices. Most of the practices that he does are related to insight and compassion. Yes?
What's the impact of environments in mindfulness training?
Environment?
Yes, because we all, I mean, is it that regardless of what is going on in your life, what is the environment in which you walk, the culture of where you are, that would have an impact on, are there times that mindfulness would not be as effective in your life? And are there times that mindfulness actually cannot be trained, or you are going to show aversion to learning?
Yes. So thank you for asking that. It's a really important question. This work, I think, can be distorted to the point of really blaming the victim. And so I certainly think that, and the evidence clearly shows, that environments play an enormously important role, context play an enormously important role in shaping our well-being. And so those who are trying to use mindfulness training to help people adjust to conditions that are fundamentally unjust and unreasonable, that's a real problem. So I think that we need to be extremely sensitive to those issues. And certainly there are conditions that facilitate this kind of training and other conditions that may impede or in some way make it more difficult. Having said all that, one of the things that's emphasized in these traditions is that the essence, particularly of mindfulness, is awareness. And anything could be support for awareness, anything, including certain kinds of negative emotional states. If we're irritable, we can use the irritability to help support awareness. All of which helps us to recognize that our awareness is something different from the content of awareness. And most of the time, the content of awareness and awareness itself are fused. And we call this experiential fusion, and this represents an absence of meta-awareness. And being meta-aware enables us to separate awareness itself from the content of awareness. And with that, we can, I think, make some progress in the cultivation of well-being. But having said that, there are certain extreme environments, particularly, that make it very difficult to do that. And so that's why, if you're first learning these practices, it's better to do it in a place that is relatively quiet, not, in the middle of Times Square. That would not be a particularly conducive place, although it would be said that at some point, once you really learn these skills, that's a perfectly fine place to do this. There's no place where it's not possible.
I agree that when you become a master in this skill, then you are safe. But as we are trying to teach our undergraduate students to become mindful, as we are trying to expand the general population that this is a good thing, I think the environment is playing it.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you. Completely. Yes. Yes, please.
When do you call a person skillful in well-being?
Pardon?
When do you when you say that a person is skillful in well-being, is it based on the standards of how a Dalai Lama meditates, or how do you?
So the question is, how do we know when a person is skilled in well-being? And I think the honest answer is we don't really know know at this point in time. We are continuously trying to develop better measures of this construct. One of the things that Vivek Murthy, the person I was referring to earlier, who was the former Surgeon General of the United States, he said that the single most important thing that's impeding the study of well-being and taking well-being more seriously is the paucity of good measures. And so until we have a toolbox of agreed upon more standardized measures, I think this will always be a problem. But I think we're moving in the right direction, but we're not there yet. Yes.
I have 2 questions. First of all, thank you so much for this great talk. And my first question was, I was wondering how you recruited the people who meditated every day for 10 years.
Well, we've recruited different populations of long-term meditators. We have one group that are the super long-term meditators, kind of Olympic athletes of meditation. We had the best recruiter on the planet to recruit participants for that, and that was the Dalai Lama himself. So he chose those participants for us. The more conventional work that we've done, we've recruited participants nationally by putting advertisements in places where those kind of people might look. We ask for referrals, and we go through a whole set of interviews to evaluate their participants before we enter them into the protocol.
Thank you.
Sure.
And I was also wondering, you said the Dalai Lama practices compassion and insight meditation. I was wondering if you could just briefly explain what insight meditation entails.
Sure. That's an important question. So there are different brands of insight meditation. The kind of meditation that the Dalai Lama does a lot of is a form of meditation that is hardly taught here in the West, and it received very, very, very little scientific study. And it is a form of meditation that actually uses reasoning as its primary tool. And it's called analytic meditation. And a form of it would be, for example, where you focus on the self and you ask yourself a series of questions. Where is myself? What is myself? What color is it? How large is it? And you just go through a whole unending series of questions about the self. And what you eventually end up with is that it's really, it can't be located, it's a lot more fluid than it was cracked up to be in the first place. There are many more questions that you have about it, and it's basically a way to loosen the grip that the over-identification of the self typically is in many of us. Yes?
I was wondering, so you would talk about purpose. I'm wondering what, and you said there are practices to enhance purpose.
Yeah. Primary practices, imagine this is the last day of your life. And there are a whole series of practices where it can very dramatically elevate sense of purpose just like that. And it's incredible how powerful it can be and how just a short taste of it can give you a hint of how it can work. So these are practices that are deployed routinely in this tradition, that are done all the time. Yes?
Dorinda Mori. Yes, we use this in gerontology. Thank you for your nourishing talk.
Thank you.
Our chapters are strengthened in this. I was wondering if you would say what you wish for Rao and the community here.
Thank you for giving me the invitation. So the last time I visited USC, there wasn't a center for mindfulness, and it's really heartening to see it emerging and beginning to flourish and bringing together different entities on this extremely extremely large and diverse campus, and bringing faculty from different units together. I think that there's enormous potential, and I love the initiative that is focused on the staff and faculty and students of USC. I forget what you guys call it here. Mindful USC, yeah. So, you know, I think that it's great to begin locally in that way. And one of the aspirations that I have is that as you guys and other groups start to do this, first of all, that we can do this collaboratively because there's strength in numbers. We've begun to work informally with colleagues at two other large universities at Penn State and the University of Virginia around student well-being. And parenthetically, I've been talking to directors of student health services at our universities, and everyone reports the same thing, that they cannot hire a sufficient number of mental health counselors to deal with the crisis on the campuses today. And so one of my aspirations is that as we develop better proximal measures of these core constructs of well-being, we can relate them to what I think of as distal measures. Distal measures are measures that a university might care about, measures like graduation rate, substance abuse among the students, criminal activity, all those kinds of things. Those are all really relevant and important distal measures. And if we are successful, and I believe that, there's a little bit of evidence that speaks to this, that our proximal measures will predict these distal measures. And so we can then begin to build the case for why this stuff is not a luxury, but there's an urgent need for it in a way that will really impact the measures that these organizations really care about. So I think you guys are well positioned to begin to do that here, and any way that we can be helpful, and we've already thought about some opportunities for collaboration in the conversations that we've had earlier today. I would love to support in whatever ways we can. Yes.
Thank you. I have a question about the implications of your work, and I'm wondering what you would suggest for all of us in this room who care a lot about mindfulness, as mentors, as advisors, as instructors. What can we do individually to promote and cultivate the well-being of our students?
Well, it's a great question, and thank you for asking. I think I would say at least among the most important things that you can do is to exemplify these qualities yourself, to be the change that you seek to inculcate in others. It's really the most powerful way that we can teach this. And it means being serious about our own well-being and practicing. One of the things that I often say is, when human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And now virtually every person on the planet brushes their teeth. This is a learned behavior. It is not part of our genome. And we do this because we recognize that this is something important for our personal physical hygiene. I would venture to say that most of this audience would agree that our minds are even more important than our teeth. And if we spend even the short amount of time that we spend every day brushing our teeth, if all of us made a commitment today to spend an amount of time equivalent to what we spend brushing our teeth, nourishing the positive qualities of our mind, this world would be a different place. I have that strong conviction. And that's the kind of public health message that I think we need to get out there.
So a lot of what you talked about focused on positive emotional states. Have you looked at how the long-term meditators confront negative emotional states as they go through, say, some of the other pillars other than compassion, the different types of meditation, in order to overcome them? Because I can see a person that is trying to become self-aware may become very, may be overindulged with the negative thoughts that come about with themselves. So how do they address them in each of these pillars in order to
Yeah, so that's
adopt positive
an important point, a very important issue. A few things to say about that. People often report when they first start mindfulness practices that not only aren't they feeling much better, but actually they're feeling a little worse. And they say, great, now you're on the right track. Because if you're actually reporting that you're feeling worse, it means you're becoming more aware of what's going on in your mind. And most of us have minds that are very, very chaotic. And if we actually paid attention to what's going on, I think for a lot of us, it may increase our anxiety a little bit, which is okay, as long as it's not too much. The most important strategy in dealing with negative emotions is to understand that they're not permanent, that they will change, and to be able to deploy meta-awareness, where we don't overly identify with those emotions. We don't experience them as who we are. We simply experience them like clouds in the sky. They're happening, they're moving, but they'll eventually disappear. But that takes training. You can't just tell a person to do that. It would be like telling a person who has not done any physical exercise and who's sort of hunched over to stand up straight. And they may stand up straight for a couple of seconds, but they don't have the core body strength to stand up straight for much longer. And that's true in this realm as well. You need to exercise these basic skills in order to support this and to enable it to spontaneously be deployed in real world settings.
We have time for one more question. Please.
You talked about the importance of well-being as a public health issue, which is really interesting, and attention is a component of that. What are your thoughts on mobile devices and social media and the impact there?
You know, I think that first of all, mobile devices are here to stay. We're not going to get rid of them. And so if we're not going to get rid of them, we need to figure out how we can A, change our relationship with them so that they don't cause more suffering. And B, is it possible to actually use these devices for the good? And I believe that the answer is yes to both of those questions, that we can change our relationship to these devices. You know, we don't have to check our phone 200 times a day. We don't have to put our phones on the table during the meeting. In fact, there are hard-nosed data to show that the mere presence of a phone on a desk or a table is sufficient to degrade the interpersonal interaction in a meeting, even if there are no notifications that go off on the phone, just the mere presence of the phone. In our center, we have phone beds where you put your phone on the bed to rest. You can charge it before you enter the room where we have meetings. Not everyone follows it. We're not dictatorial about it, but we invite people to just give it up for now. And so this is something that we can all learn to do. But it takes a cultural change. And I do think that there are some, not all, some tech companies that believe that their devices have been problematic in this way, and they're searching for solutions. And so I think that particularly if some of those large entities come on board, I think there is some opportunity for meaningful change. So thank you all very much.